So Gustavo Petro, he's got a pretty colorful past. He's a former guerrilla rebel in Colombia, but then he's also made the pivot into mainstream Colombian politics. So he was actually mayor of Bogota for 3 years. He's been, I believe, in the Senate once and in the lower house twice. And he's the leftist candidate for president in Colombia's elections. I hate the term leftists and rightists in this context, but and maybe we can get into that later. But that's the shorthand for now. And he did really well in the first round of Colombia's elections, but he didn't get 50% of the vote. So now it goes to a runoff. He's run before, as I said. In the last election, he actually lost to a sort of center right coalition that came up against him because everybody's afraid of his leftist credentials. He talks about wanting to end all oil exploration in Colombia, which is a big deal because oil exports are something like 45% of Colombia's total exports. He talks about taxing the rich. He's all about socially redistributive policies and things like that that make businessmen and investors quake in their boots. So that's him in a nutshell. I'm sort of a little bit of a contrarian on this because I think the implications either way are not particularly good. I sort of alluded to the fact that he's called a leftist as shorthand, but I think that both him and Rodolfo Hernandez are both populists, and they are both anti-establishment populists. And either one of them, if they come into office, they're going to come into office against a legislative branch that is very divided, that they won't be able to control. So Petro might be saying a lot of things on the campaign trail that if he were able to execute would be very scary and would be extremely negative for the investment climate in the country, for the business climate in the country, but he's not going to be able to do any of it. I think a really good analog for what we're looking at in Colombia's elections right now is what happened in Peru, where you had Pedro Castillo, who I would actually argue is much more to the left in terms of economic policy than Petro has come to power. Everybody was really scared, but because he had no support in Congress, he's been unable to do anything. And that has not looked like, another Venezuela happening in Peru, and I'm not expecting another Venezuela in Colombia if Petro wins. What it looks like is complete and total dysfunction, an inability to get anything done policy wise, a lot of uncertainty and a lot of clashes between different factions that are all trying to work against each other. So there's a lot of scary things that Petro says, I think, from an investment point of view. And for folks that are thinking about Colombia from an investment perspective, it's definitely a negative, especially the narrative that comes with that. But I think the bigger story here is that you've got two candidates, one of whom is going to be president, who are completely outside the normal establishment, who have no support in Colombia's legislature, and who are going to have a very hard time governing no matter what happens. And that's bad for Colombia in general because they have a lot of challenges coming, and you're going to need some strong governance to get through them. Yeah, so Hernandez is a colorful character. Apparently, because the media has to think of everything in terms of Donald Trump, he's been called the Donald Trump of Colombia. He does share some of those characteristics. He's a rich mogul who made a fortune in real estate and various other things. He's a late charger in the election. Even 2 to 3 months ago, he was polling well below other candidates in the polls. It's really just in the last month that support for him has exploded. He's been able to do that by leveraging social media. He refers to himself as the king of TikTok, and apparently his TikTok videos have been so good that a lot of Colombians want to vote for him. He's basically had one core message, which is he's anti-corruption. He thinks corruption is the thing that is really ailing Colombia, and he says he's going to get rid of corruption. I said that he's anti-establishment. He did serve as mayor of a town for a while, but more to the point, he's also under investigation for various things that happened in terms of his business dealings and some of the things that happened when he was a mayor. So he talks anti-corruption, but at the same time, he himself is under investigation for the very things that he accuses other people of. Now, he, of course, says that that is all part of the political move against him. The real question is, if he came into power, would he be able to work with all of these politicians who he just castigated as completely and totally corrupt? The other sort of center right candidates have already voiced their support for Hernandez because they think Hernandez, I guess, is the lesser of two evils. They see Petro as a real big threat. But in a poll that came out this morning, it looks like they're kind of even. But in terms of implications for if Hernandez wins, the honest answer is we don't exactly know. We don't know a lot about what kinds of policies he would pursue. We don't know if he will be able to build bridges with with the other parts of Colombia's government. There's a lot of uncertainty there. So I would hesitate to say that we know exactly what Hernandez is going to do. All we know is that it's going to be a bumpy ride, and that you're going to get a lot of uncertainty, even if probably the business environment and the investment policies will be more friendly than they would be under Petro. Yeah, like I said, I don't see it. I mean, there obviously is a huge difference between these two candidates in terms of the type of policies that they would put forward. And they have very different worldviews about what ails Colombia. Um, Petro really thinks in terms of inequality as a big problem. He has said that the first thing that he'll do when he comes to office is declare a state of emergency against hunger in the country. And that's a big deal because Colombia imports a lot of grains from abroad. And because of the Russia Ukraine war, grain prices are going up and grain security is a big issue. So those are the things that he thinks about. Hernandez doesn't think in those terms. He's thinking in terms of corruption, and otherwise, he doesn't want to raise taxes and redistribute programs via social programs and things like that. He thinks more in terms of let's do more oil exploration. Let's make sure that the business environment is unhindered by red tape and corruption. And that way, he's going to grease the wheels. The problem is, I don't see any path for either one of them to get anything done. So it's not like Petro is going to come in and be able to turn Colombia into Venezuela. He's facing a legislative branch that will be completely opposed to everything that he's trying to push through. Same thing with Hernandez. He's going to come to power and face a whole room of people who he spent this entire campaign saying are morally corrupt and degenerate and aren't worth anything. Are they going to work with him? Is he going to be able to author some of those same policies? So I think either way, in terms of what Colombia is looking at, you've got a country that just a year ago had its sovereign debt reduced to junk status. You've got a widening fiscal deficit. You've got really a country that is overwhelmingly dependent on commodity exports, especially oil, but it doesn't have a lot of manufacturing, doesn't have a lot of potential going forward, and also has seen rising poverty and rising violence. So yes, these two candidates, I think, paint very different pictures of the world, and if they didn't have constraints acting on them, they would create very different outcomes for Colombia. But I'm not convinced either one of them is going to be able to do anything. I think they're both going to inherit a very difficult situation, and they're going to be constrained by a lot of these forces around them. A great example of what I'm talking about is the current Colombian administration, under Ivan Duque. He came to power as a center-right candidate, promising to cut taxes, promising to be good for Colombia's business environment. And instead, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, what did he do? He raised taxes. And that's what caused all of the protests that came out against him and caused some of this disillusionment with Colombia's political class. So there's what these candidates say they're going to do. And those are very different things. But in terms of what they're actually going to be able to do, I think not so much. And so I think either way, we're looking at a Colombia that is going to be dysfunctional politically, that is not going to be able to govern with any confidence. And I think you're going to see a lot of political squabbling and internal dissension rather than policies on either side, no matter who wins, to try and fix Colombia's underlying problems. Not a ton. Colombia is not a huge player in the global economy. I alluded to the fact that about half of their exports are oil exports. They're still only exporting about 1% of oil exports globally. So there will be some isolated impacts, especially at the regional level, especially some countries that are dependent from Colombia from that point of view. But I don't think you're looking at a huge sort of global systemic issue. The area where this gets global, though, is that Colombia really is strategically located. Um, the reason the United States cares so much about Colombia, and the reason that Colombia has been arguably the closest US ally in Latin America for decades, is because it is right alongside the Panama Canal. It's right bordering near Venezuela. This is the part of Latin America that makes the U.S. the most nervous, and is what the U.S. is always concerned about from a national security perspective. So if you had a Colombia that was beginning to teeter, that was beginning maybe to try and look abroad for more options outside of the U.S. Colombia relationship, you might have takers like China or other countries around the world that would be willing to invest. So if you started to see some of those things, I do think you might see some global impact. But in terms of how investors are actually going to experience at a global level what's happening in Colombia, not very much. I think this is really about people who are in Colombia themselves or who have made a bet on Colombia from an emerging market perspective. And even though Colombia has a lot of potential and has a lot of things from an emerging market that you would like. For me, Colombia is neither a long nor a short. It's a stay away. There is just too much uncertainty right now in this particular election for me to have any confidence on whether Petro or Hernandez is going to win and how either one of them would govern once they win.